Imagine a world where writing already exists, but paper does not. Every word you want to save is heavy, expensive, fragile, or painfully hard to carry. That was the real world for most of human history. And then, in China, a new material appeared. It looked simple, thin, ordinary, but it would go on to change books, trade, governments, and the everyday rhythm of modern life. Before we go further, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from today. It helps me find interesting stories and topics from your part of the world. Now, let's travel back together. Long before the first piece of paper was ever made, humans already knew how to write. We had great ideas, deep thoughts, and important histories to tell. But we had a massive physical problem. Knowledge was just too heavy. Think about the ancient people in Mesopotamia. When they wanted to write down a simple record, they had to press marks into wet mud. Imagine holding a thick, heavy clay tablet in your hands just to read a few sentences. If you dropped it, your words would shatter into pieces. Over in Egypt, they found a different way. They sliced up a plant called papyrus, a tall plant that grew near rivers, pressed it together, and dried it in the sun. It was much lighter than a brick of mud, but papyrus was easy to break. It would easily dry out, crack, and fall apart if the weather wasn't perfect. Move over to ancient East Asia, and you'd see scholars writing on long strips of bamboo or wood. They tied these heavy wooden strips together with string. To read a single short book, you had to carry a giant, heavy, and difficult-to-use bundle of wood that could easily fill a whole wagon. And what if you wanted something lighter? Well, you could write on animal skin, like leather, or even soft, beautiful silk. But those materials were painfully expensive. Only kings or the absolute richest people could afford to use them. For thousands of years, the human race was stuck. We had the brilliant invention of writing, but our writing surfaces were holding us back. They were either too heavy to carry, too bulky to store, too easy to break to last, or simply too expensive for normal people to touch. Knowledge couldn't really travel fast or reach a lot of people when the words themselves weighed a ton. The problem of civilization wasn't just having an alphabet. The real problem was finding a material light, cheap, and flexible enough to let knowledge travel. We desperately needed something that could set our words free. The world had been writing for a very long time, but it was missing the exact material that could make knowledge light. And that answer was about to arrive. But it didn't come from where most of the world might have expected it. While the rest of the world was carving stones and carrying heavy bundles of wood, a quiet revolution was happening in ancient China. During the Han Dynasty, people started experimenting with a completely new way to record information. The answer to humanity's heavy problem didn't come from expensive materials. It came from mashed-up plants, tree bark, and old rags. They took these simple, everyday things, soaked them in water until they broke apart, and beat them into a wet, cloudy soup. Then, they dipped a flat wooden screen into the water, lifted it up to catch the floating tiny threads, and let it dry in the warm sun. When they carefully peeled it off the screen, they had something the world had never seen before. A thin, flat, flexible sheet. Around the year 105 AD, a court official named Kai Lun changed everything. He didn't necessarily invent the very first piece of paper out of thin air, but he perfected the recipe. He figured out exactly how to mix inner tree bark, hemp, old cloth, and even torn fishing nets to create a writing surface that was smooth, strong, and reliable. He took a rough experiment and turned it into a reliable and consistent tool. And here is something history rarely stops to point out. Almost every material that came before paper, clay, silk, animal skin, started as something valuable, Paper started as garbage, old rags, torn fishing nets, bark that nobody wanted. It is probably the only invention in human history where the raw material was literally something people threw away, and the finished product ended up on the desks of emperors. Here is what makes this moment so powerful. Paper didn't win because it was a luxury item for the rich. It won because it was wildly practical. Remember those ancient scholars we talked about? Instead of dragging a heavy cart full of bamboo strips just to read the local laws, a person could now carry a whole stack of paper under one arm. It was a completely different feeling. It was light. It was incredibly cheap to produce because people could literally make it out of waste materials. And it was easy to stack on a shelf without taking up a whole room. For the first time in human history, the physical weight of knowledge was gone. A merchant could keep track of massive trades without carrying heavy clay tablets. A government could send fast messages across the country without needing a team of strong horses just to carry the heavy wood. Paper was the perfect solution. It took the heavy and difficult world of writing and made it feel effortless. But a brilliant invention is just a local trick if it stays in one place. Paper was amazing, but for hundreds of years, it remained a Chinese secret. It solved the problem for one massive empire, while the rest of the globe was still struggling with expensive animal skins and easy-to-break leaves. But a light piece of paper wasn't enough to change the world on its own. It still had to leave the place where it was born. Now, it had to prove something else, that it could travel, be learned, and be recreated by other cultures. A great invention only gains true historical power when it shows that it can survive outside of its hometown. For hundreds of years, paper was mostly kept within the borders of China, but eventually the secret began to slip out. It naturally traveled alongside Buddhist monks, exploring scholars, and skilled workers. The first stop on this journey was the Korean peninsula. The people there didn't just buy Chinese paper, they learned the actual technology. They figured out exactly how to mash the plants and use the wooden screens themselves. This was a massive step forward. It proved that the recipe for paper could be successfully copied and kept alive by a completely different society. From Korea, the craft quickly crossed the sea into Japan. And here is where something beautiful happened. The Japanese didn't just use paper as a simple, cheap surface for government records. They fully accepted it and transformed it into a core part of their daily life. They created their own unique, high-quality traditions of papermaking. They used it for stunning calligraphy, delicate artwork, sliding doors in their homes, and beautiful folding fans. Paper became something elegant and deeply cultural. It proved that it was flexible enough to adapt to whatever a new society needed it to be. This was the exact moment paper went from being a closed, local invention to a living technology that could spread and evolve. It showed the world that it could cross borders and survive on its own. However, as important as this Eastern journey was, paper had not yet stepped into the phase where it would completely rewrite the global systems of knowledge and power. It had proven it could travel, but the path that would cause the biggest explosion in human history didn't go east. It went west. Paper had left its birthplace. Now the question is, when it arrives in a completely different world, what will it become? The story of paper going global usually starts with a battle, a capture, and a stolen secret. But what happened next was far more important than any war. Historians often point to the Battle of Talas in the year 751. According to legend, during this clash between empires, Arab forces captured Chinese soldiers who knew the closely guarded secret of making paper. Whether this famous story is the exact truth or just a dramatic symbol, it marks a perfect starting line. It is the moment paper officially entered the Islamic world, And in this new environment, paper didn't just survive, it exploded. At that time, the Islamic world was a vast, wealthy, and highly connected empire. Most importantly, it was deeply hungry for knowledge. The secret of papermaking quickly took root in cities like Samarkand, where workers built the first busy paper mills, places where paper was made, outside of East Asia. From there, it traveled straight to Baghdad, a city that was rapidly becoming the learning and thinking center of the world. This was a massive turning point in human history. Here, paper completely changed its role. It wasn't just a simple surface for taking notes anymore. It was plugged directly into a huge, organized network of power, trade, and learning. Think about the bustling streets and grand halls of the Middle East. Scholars finally had a cheap, reliable material to translate ancient Greek philosophy and record brand new discoveries in math and astronomy. Traveling merchants used paper to write down long business records, contracts, and trade agreements. Government officials used mountains of it to collect taxes and manage a giant, complex society. Before paper arrived, building a large library was incredibly difficult and expensive. Because of paper, the Islamic world was able to build massive libraries, packing them with thousands of books on science, medicine, and religion. Paper had quietly become the hidden engine of a golden age. It had proven its ultimate value. It wasn't just a tool for lonely monks or quiet artists anymore. It was the physical foundation of a working, thinking, and trading society. Once paper became the everyday foundation of the Middle East, its next great leap was impossible to stop. It was sitting right on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. The journey into Europe was only a matter of time. And when a material makes writing this easy, it doesn't just feed books. It feeds the very machine of society. Imagine a giant stage being set up in the dark before a massive show. That is exactly what paper was doing when it finally crossed the Mediterranean Sea into Europe. It didn't happen overnight. Through busy trading areas in places like Spain and Sicily, the knowledge of papermaking slowly slipped into the European continent. At first, European kings and church monks didn't really trust it. They were used to writing their holy books and royal laws on parchment, a writing material made from thick animal skin. Parchment was incredibly expensive and heavy, but they believed it was strong and permanent. To them, this new paper from the East seemed like a cheap, easy-to-break trick. But you cannot argue with convenience, and you certainly cannot argue with price. Traveling merchants were the first to truly embrace it. If you are trading goods across different countries, you need to write down a lot of numbers, daily records, and business letters. You can't use expensive animal skin for everyday math. Paper was the perfect, cheap tool for the fast-moving world of trade. And this tells you something important about how new materials actually win. Paper wasn't better than parchment in every way. Parchment lasted longer. It felt more permanent. The church trusted it. But paper didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be cheap enough that a merchant didn't feel guilty using it for everyday math. In history, the material that wins is rarely the best one. It's the one that's good enough and affordable enough to reach everyone. Soon, European towns began building their own paper mills, places where workers turned old cloth into fresh sheets of paper. They used the power of rushing river water to turn giant wooden wheels, which constantly smashed old cloth rags into a soft, wet mixture. The production got faster, the material got even cheaper, and slowly, paper crept into European universities, government offices, and local markets. Here is the most important part of this chapter. When we think of how knowledge exploded in Europe, we usually give all the credit to a famous machine.
But before anyone could even dream of printing thousands of books, they desperately needed a material cheap enough to print them on. You cannot mass-produce cheap books if you have to kill a whole flock of sheep just to make the pages. Paper was quietly building the foundation. It was filling up the desks of scholars and the leather bags of merchants. The piles of written words were growing higher and higher. Europe had finally found a material that could hold unlimited ideas without costing a fortune. The stage was completely set. The cheap material was finally everywhere. All Europe needed now was a machine that could multiply the words. And when that machine finally arrived, history would accelerate in a way no one could ever reverse.
The printing press usually gets all the glory in history books. But a machine that copies words is completely useless without a cheap place to put them. Actually, the idea of printing wasn't completely new. Over in East Asia, people had been carving words into large wooden blocks, covering them with ink and pressing them onto paper for a long time. They had already proven that paper was the perfect partner for printing. It absorbed ink beautifully and was flexible enough to be pressed flat. But in 15th century Europe, this combination reached a whole new, explosive level. When the mechanical printing press was finally developed, it was a hungry machine. It needed something that expensive animal skins simply couldn't provide. It needed thousands and thousands of cheap, smooth sheets. It desperately needed the very paper that had been quietly building up across the continent. What happened next was a massive, rapid growth. Try to picture it. Busy, noisy print shops suddenly popping up in cities everywhere. Giant stacks of blank paper went into the wooden machines, and piles of finished books came out. Before this moment, a monk might spend an entire year carefully copying just one holy book by hand. Now, a small team with a machine and a tall stack of paper could produce hundreds of copies in a matter of weeks. This is the exact moment where the world truly changed. The printing press is famous, but cheap paper is what actually allowed mass information to happen. It brought the price of knowledge crashing down. Suddenly, books were no longer locked away with heavy chains in rich, private libraries. Thousands of cheap printed papers, religious debates, and translated stories started flying across towns and cities. Normal people, not just kings or scholars, could hold new ideas in their own hands. The power of information had officially broken out of the control of the wealthy and powerful. Every major revolution of ideas in the centuries that followed, religious reform, new science, new theories of government, had one thing in common that nobody talks about. They all needed somewhere cheap to live. Ideas don't spread by themselves. They need a surface. And that surface has to be affordable enough to be copied, passed around, and held by ordinary hands. Paper was that surface. Before the ideas, there was always the material. If you look closely at this exact moment in history, you'll see a massive shift. Up until now, paper was just a safe container to hold knowledge. But from this point forward, paper wasn't just saving information anymore. It was multiplying it on a massive, society-wide scale. Once words could be copied by the thousands, paper was no longer just the quiet material of wise scholars. It was about to flood into every single corner of our modern world. A single, cheap sheet of paper had rewritten the rules of society. But once letters and words could be mass-produced, paper was no longer just a material for learning. But in the 19th century, paper changed again. It stopped being only a surface for books and laws and became part of the fast, everyday rhythm of modern life. By then, the world was hungry for more words than ever before. Newspapers were growing, schools were expanding, governments were producing more records, and businesses needed more packaging, labels, and paperwork. But there was a problem. For a long time, paper was still made from old cloth rags, and there simply was not enough old fabric to feed this new demand. So manufacturers turned to the forests. They learned how to grind wood into a soft, wet mixture, and that changed everything. At the same time, large industrial machines replaced slow hand production. Instead of making paper one sheet at a time, factories could now produce huge, continuous rolls at a speed the older world could never have imagined. And once paper became that cheap, it stopped feeling precious. It began to appear everywhere. A newspaper on the doorstep in the morning, a school notebook on a child's desk, train tickets, posters, receipts, government forms, cardboard boxes, and wrapping paper moving through shops and cities every single day. But there's something else worth noticing. Before paper was cheap, the people who controlled writing materials controlled the official story. Kings decided what was recorded. Churches decided what was copied. When paper became cheap enough for anyone to use, for the first time in history, the official version of events had competition. Cheap paper didn't just spread knowledge, it made forgetting and erasing a lot harder to do. This was another major shift in the story of paper. It was no longer just a material for scholars, monks, merchants, or rulers. It had become the quiet foundation of ordinary life. It carried the news people read at breakfast, the lessons children learned at school, the records governments used to manage society, and the packaging that moved goods through the industrial world. Paper had finally become a material for the masses. But that new success came with a subtle change. Once something becomes cheap enough to use everywhere, it also becomes easy to waste. Paper was still helping modern life move faster, but it was no longer treated with the same care it once had. It had become useful, ordinary, and increasingly easy to throw away. Today, paper might not seem like a miracle anymore, but every time you hold a piece of it, you are holding the exact material that built the modern world. We started our journey in a world where words were incredibly heavy. People struggled with mud, wood, and expensive animal skins just to remember their own history. Then, a simple mix of mashed plants and old rags in ancient China completely changed the rules. It proved it could travel across Asia. It built the libraries of the Middle East. It fed the printing presses of Europe. And finally, it became the fast, beating rhythm of our everyday lives. Paper shows us a beautiful truth about civilization. History isn't just changed by wars, empires, or huge inventions. Sometimes the world is completely transformed by something small, light, and perfectly ordinary. A simple material that made human memory cheap, allowed ideas to travel far, and gave knowledge to everyone. If you watched the video this far, I want to ask you something. What other ordinary invention do you think has quietly changed the world just as much as paper, but is rarely talked about? Let me know down in the comments, and if you enjoy stories about how simple things changed human civilization, the next video you should watch is about the history of ink, or the history of the book. See you there.